So briefly, who we are, Playful. We are a small studio in Texas, a little bit north of Dallas. We're about 30 developers. We've been working on VR now for quite a while, perhaps one of the earliest collaborations with Oculus, actually, and we are deeply involved with them now on a project that they're publishing that we've been working on for about 6 or 8 months, since the beginning of this year. That's Dan and I. This is Dan.
Hello, how you doing?
Oh, does your microphone work? Yeah. I'm the CEO of Playful, and Dan is the design director on Lucky's Tale, which we're going to tell you about today. First, just real quick, briefly, on a little bit of our history, who we are, but I'm going to go through this stuff as fast as possible. Before the VR stuff, Playful, the studio, is made up of a lot of developers who have been working together for about 20 years on games in Dallas. A lot of us got our start together at Ensemble Studios almost 20 years ago, maybe even more than 20 years ago. No, a little less than 20 years ago. And created a game called Age of Empires and a series. Eventually, we sold that company to Microsoft. We worked at Microsoft for a while on more Age of Empires games and some of the Halo properties. Then about 5 years ago, a couple of us left Ensemble Studios behind because we saw something that changed our lives, and that was the iPhone. The very first time we held it in our hands, this was a piece of technology that just transformed the way we thought about the future of our careers and our lives and everything else. I mean, I think, I remember the sensation I had the first time that I walked into the Apple Store and I was able to hold it in my hands, and I felt like the future had been brought forward 10 years from what I expect, or 20 years, or something like that. It was just the weirdest sensation. Anyway, it convinced us that we didn't really know how it was going to work, but we needed to leave and go make games for this right away. So we left behind some great friends and colleagues at Ensemble Studios and created a company called New Toy, and started working on some iPhone games. And this was before that was popular. So many of our friends thought we were crazy to do this. And this device, at the time we left to go do this, there wasn't even an app store or anything like that. We were really in uncharted territory. But first game we shipped was called Chess with Friends, and quickly afterwards we shipped Words with Friends. That game, I think you guys probably have seen it and played it. It exploded in popularity. It was an incredible journey for us, and privileged to be able to have worked on that game and to connect it with so many players. Worked on that game for a couple years, ended up selling it to Zynga, and we stayed at Zynga for a few years, and then 5 years after that initial experience of launching with friends and leaving behind Age of Empires and kind of moving over to iPhone games, the same thing happened again. And I remember, this was just, so now, it's hard to describe, because when we went through this transition from traditional game development into iPhone games, I thought, this is such an unbelievable thing. This is a once-in-a-career type of opportunity. I will never again go through this level of disruption in the games industry, moving, what happened with the iPhone. And so then 5 years later, I find myself in Palmer's office, and this was right after we had left Zynga, and I was just kind of, reaching out to some friends and traveling around and trying to see some cool stuff. Flew out here and saw this. This is one of the very first prototypes of what eventually became the DK1. And I remember walking into the office. This was right before the Kickstarter had launched, actually. And I heard about this through John, through Carmack, who had kind of set up the trip, and we went out there to visit them. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, because I felt like I just went through this 5 years ago, and this level of disruption is not supposed to happen every 5 years. Like, if you look at the traditional game industry, it's more like a 15-year cycle between major upsets, major disruptions. But I felt like when I saw this that I had no doubt that it was about to happen again. So actually, that's kind of fast forward. We started working with Oculus. This was now 2 years ago. We're going to tell you a lot about that story today. I'm going to let Dan jump into kind of the beginning parts of that story, but just to give you a little bit of an overview, like I said, we've worked with Oculus now for 2 years. We've worked on a series of projects with them. The very first project that we started was right actually after the Kickstarter launched, and the original vision was a consumer version of the Rift is going to launch at the end of 2013, I think was the original plan. So we're all excited about that. We saw the DK1. We're like, yeah, people are going to love this. Gamers are going to love this. Let's go build a game for this. And we said, well, what are we going to do? And Oculus had some ideas. We had some ideas. We settled on this idea of inspired by this game, Wii Sports. So I'm sure most of you guys have seen this. When the Wii originally came out, the Nintendo Wii, it had this crazy motion control that nobody had ever seen before. And they really had to prove to the audience that this was a legitimate, valuable game platform that people wanted to buy. And it was kind of, I think, I probably thought at the time, a little bit difficult of a hurdle to say, so now here, go buy a $200 Wii and then also go buy a $50 game. And you're looking at this controller and it's like, it doesn't even look like a game controller. How is this fun? I don't know. I don't understand. This is a new way of gaming that I've never experienced. What Nintendo did is they shipped a free pack-in game called Wii Sports that proved the value of their platform from the get-go. So the moment you saw somebody swing a tennis racket by just swinging their hand, or or
go bowling or anything
like that. Go bowling, anything
yeah.
like that, you got it instantly. You're like, great, that's awesome. I want to play that. And Nintendo went on to dominate that generation, at least initially, with that console. We want to do the same thing for VR. We felt like it's going to be the same thing. People are going to see this device, and they're going to go out and buy it, and they're going to put it on, and they're going to be like, okay, what are the types of experiences I can have in this device? Because this is completely new. I've never seen this before. So we wanted to try and deliver a series of lightweight, and actually at the time we were working on this, we said VR toys, not even games, just experiences that you could have that were one after another, just like, okay, now I'm on a hot air balloon, now I'm swimming underwater, now I'm in an aquarium, now I'm whatever, and each one of those being unique and showing you something you hadn't seen that proved the value of this shiny new VR device you bought.
They had to be immediate and they had to be impactful.
So we actually worked on that for 4 months, and we're going to talk about kind of some of the lessons and the things we ran into as we were working on that. Come the end of 2013, I think we all realized, yeah, Oculus actually isn't going to ship a consumer device this year, and that kind of all those plans changed, and this is kind of a theme of today's talk. You're going to see, and I think you guys have probably experienced yourselves if you've been working on VR as game developers or anywhere, kind of aligned with this amazing stuff that's happening is literally it changes every 3-4 months. It's impossible to even keep up with it. The rate of change and progression here from one generation of technology to the next is so disruptive that, we've just had to get used to that. We've had to integrate it into our development process. But anyway, when we got to the end of 2013, realized, okay, we're not actually targeting a consumer version then. Maybe the consumer version will be the end of 2014. We don't know. So we went back to the drawing board and started working on this game. And again, we're going to get into a lot more of kind of what that process has been like for us. The end result was we showed a version of this game at E3 earlier this year. And the reaction to it, the reception was pretty phenomenal. I think we were so happy to see the thing that we're always aiming for, which is smiles on people's faces and kind of this reaction of joy and delight, and that's kind of what happened when we showed it at E3. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Here you go.
Cool. So we wanted to talk a little bit about just the whole development process of this game and like how we got from handling our first DK1 to getting to Lucky's Tale. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about a game that has existed, and you've probably heard of it if you follow the indie scene a lot, The Unfinished Swan, right? So it was interesting because I was trying to figure out a good way to explain how development for a completely new piece of hardware, specifically VR and the Rift, how to communicate, I think, the emotion and everything that's involved in that. And so to set the stage for The Unfinished Swan a little bit, they put you essentially in a all-white room.
Has anybody played that game, by the way? Unfinished Swan? Yeah, okay.
Okay. So yeah, they put you in an all-white room, and you don't have any detail at all. And the only thing you can do to pick out the detail of the room is to essentially throw some paint. So we got a video here that should show some of that. So this really maps very closely to our experience developing for VR because when the whole canvas is completely blank and you don't know where to start, right? The only thing you can do is just throw something at the wall. Throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And sometimes you uncover like, oh, that's a wall. I see. I can't go any further in that direction. I need to stop. Sometimes the paint hits the floor and you're like, oh, I get it. I can walk over there. So that's an area for me to further explore, right? And the more you throw, the more kind of the definition of the space, how it all coalesces around you. This is a particularly cool moment where you start, in the video, you'll start picking out like a tunnel. And you're like, great, here's a really promising direction that we can go in, right? And to me, this spoke just so poignantly to that development process because, and every once in a while you'd lob a paint grenade and it'll just bounce and hit you in the face, right? And it would blind you for a little bit and you'd follow these rabbit holes and it didn't quite work out well. But I really wanted to mention this because it just very much feels like this, I think, on a day-to-day. And any of you
developing on this frontier, I mean, this is the day-to-day experience of it for us is we don't know what we're going to find. We turn another corner and it's again another blank space and we have no idea where the walls are or what the obstacles are or what the challenges are going to be. And, and again, we'll get into why that's the case. It's our particular way that we approach this and we kind of throw out all the conventions that but anyway, yeah.
Right, so I thought it was important to talk about that first. And I'm sure a lot of you can identify with that. So in order to do that, when you say, okay, so we have to define everything, and we have to start from scratch, right? So one of the first things you need to do is you need to kind of reset. You say like, okay, well, we've developed traditional games, we've developed mobile games, and now that we're developing VR games, we have to think, well, the traditional things you just fall back on as designers and as programmers and as artists, you immediately have this, you build this up, right? A pool of resources that you know how to pull out at the drop of a hat that can make something more fun or more immersive or more cool. But we had to kind of set that aside. And so in order to do that...
And so, again, this is at the beginning of this process now. So we had just set out to do the Wii Sports of VR, and I gave Dan 6 months. Well, this was the shared agreement between Oculus and us. We're going to ship a game in 6 months. We're going to try and build some, and that's an insane thing anyway. But that's what we agreed to do. Said we're going to build something to ship alongside the consumer version of the Rift, and so we're going to try and get that done in 6 months. Yeah, that was we had to come up with brand new process for how to even begin to understand that task.
And this image is perfect, right? Because you immediately have this deadline, and you're like, okay, well, knowing nothing, that means we have to do as many things as humanly possible right away. We have to just start throwing, to use a paint analogy, we have to throw not just one paintball, but like 10 at once, right? And so what we did is we ended up developing a process here that essentially did two things for us. We had to say, you must pay for the second half of day of development with the first half's progress. So what that means is like any particular idea that we had, and believe me, everything looks good on paper when you're developing for VR. You're just like, oh no, it's great. You're eaten by a dinosaur, and it's the most amazing thing because it's in VR, right? But it's in the application of those things and development of that where you realize that sometimes it doesn't quite add up. And honesty plays this really integral part to this process where you're like, I have to be honest with myself. It's not what I want it to be in a day or in a week or in a month, right? Like that can't fly initially at developing these things. We're really interested in like, what is it right now? What is the first minute like? What is the first 10 minutes like? And so to kind of go through that, what we would do is we separated out the process into a couple of touchstones, essentially. So the first 4 hours of the day would be, okay, idea one, and actually we did this in triplicate. We had 3 programmers, so we did, and this was a fairly small team, about 8 people. So we said, okay, 3 programmers, that means 3 ideas immediately at once. As a designer, it's incredibly stressful because you're used to being able to kind of sit back and say like, oh, great, I'll just noodle around, I'll make my designs, and they'll have this perfect loop, and it'll all add up and make sense, and everyone will love it, and it'll be brilliant. And you just don't have the time to do that. So immediately, from idea to development, the time had to be 0. There was no time to put it on paper because, again, everything on paper sounds great. So we would work in tandem with all the developers and be like, okay, great. First idea, it's a ball, and the ball is rolling. It's brilliant, believe me, but let's go. And every single person would start that, and we'd hack it. And then at the same time, we didn't want art sitting around waiting for us to do that, and I didn't want programmers waiting on design. So as soon as we had one thing that we knew would not change, we're like, the ball is the most important piece. It will not change. we would throw it to the artist, and they would say, okay, make the best ball possible in this short amount of time, because we were racing at that 4 hours. And at 4 hours, kind of basically by lunch, if we couldn't make the case to the rest of the studio why this idea deserved to get the second half of the day, we set it aside. And so
to understand some context here, again, we're running initially a 6-month goal of trying to ship this game.
Right.
And we believe that we're working on a new platform where the things that we had figured out about game development over the last 20 years, that almost none of them applied. That was like a basic assumption that we had heading into this. And with a 6-month schedule, we kind of just backed it out. Said, all right, well, that means 2 months of like polishing and bug fixing at the end, 2 months of kind of production in the middle. That maybe gives us at most 2 months at the beginning to come up with the set of sort of, Wii Sports-like little toys that we're going to ship, that we're going to bundle together. So that's the context that leads to this, that eventually led to, all right, we have basically 4 hours to see the initial version of an idea, then another 4 hours to see a slightly more refined version of it, and if it can't prove itself in that first day, then we're going to eject it and we're going to start something different tomorrow. Sure. The end result of that process was we initially said we'd hope to get 4 ideas done a week, and we were shipping these to Oculus on a regular basis. We were sending them stuff.
Every week. Incredibly aggressive for us. I mean, coming from nothing, that felt like a lot.
The end result was we delivered 7 games a week on average to Oculus throughout this process that went on for 6 weeks. And man, I just... So it was both the most fun we've ever had in game development and also the most exhausting. Like, imagine week 6. Dan and I walk into this room and we're like, there's no more ideas.
We're done. Yeah.
That's all the ideas.
That's it, all the ideas. We even have the one where you're just sitting in a chair and looking at a blank wall. There's nothing else, we tapped it all. But, it was interesting because as we reached that point of fatigue, I kind of think in retrospect, the reason why it actually got harder was because I think we were getting better at making the judgment, like the fly, no fly thing, earlier in the process. So we were not just necessarily stuck on ideas, which we were, but secondly, it was also like, well, but we know that's not going to work because we've done this and this and this, where we've kind of proven overall that this isn't a good avenue to pursue. So we actually believe that some of our best work came out of the hardest time of sitting in that room and staring at each other and having absolutely nothing new to bring to the table. And it's interesting to look back at those products because in the end, Oculus came back to us and said, hey, those last ones you worked on, those were brilliant. And we were like, really? Those felt like...
We can't even tell anymore.
Yeah, we can't even tell anymore. Like you just didn't... But like Paul said, it was such a fun time to do it. And anyone who starts development on the Rift, I'm sure feels that same way, that same exuberance at having that empty canvas and the same fatigue at having the empty canvas. So it really did resemble an assembly line here, which is kind of where we picked that image. Let's see if I can advance this. So, but an interesting thing happened. We realized, actually, we've been here before, right? Like this process, we kind of already know how to do this. Because going from traditional game design, the first thing that shook it all up was mobile. And suddenly, to use this kind of magic glass concept, right? You must touch the device and things must react to that touch. Like you need to scroll through a world and you can touch directly what you need. You don't need the abstraction of a controller or something guiding that. So
what we saw having gone through that when we made that transition to mobile was the language of game development on that device changed. And not all developers, I mean, this is for us in particular. A lot of developers, especially initially with the iPhone, were bringing over existing ideas and just slap a virtual D-pad on it and there's a port. We felt like that the best ideas were going to emerge from sort of abandoning what we had learned before and really just saying, all right, pretend we're just graduated college and this is the first game we've ever made and this is the device and we've never even seen another device before. What would we make?
And some of the things that were part of that language turned out to be very different than what's important in traditional game design, right? So the moment you touch the app icon, that app needs to be up and running as short as humanly possible. As short as you can make that immediately turns into a more satisfying experience. The gameplay itself can't be like, I'm sitting down on the couch, I'm ready to play this epic 80-hour game. No longer. It was like, it needs to be about a minute long, and secondly, I'm going to get a call, I'm going to get a text, I need to be able to put this thing away. It's gaming that kind of filled the interstitial moments of your life, right? So I thought that was, we thought that was pretty interesting. And so, again, as soon as that dawned on us.
Yeah, we just assumed the same would probably be true for VR. Right. That even though VR seems in some sense to have more in common with some of the traditional game development that we've done before on TVs and on PC screens, we still assumed probably the best things that are going to happen in VR are going to be the same. They're going to throw, like, the things that are going to matter about the best content in VR are not going to be things that we've ever experienced before.
And they're not anything that we probably know right now at that point in development. So, kind of some of the things that came out of that as we worked on that Wii Sports-like game experience. First thing, we were like, well, physics are cool. And they always are, like in any game, but they're even more cool in VR. They just, something that reacts as you expect it would in 3D space is just absolutely delightful.
And what you're actually going to see here over the next series of slides is a number of those prototypes that we built. These were all done in about 2 days or so with a team of 5 or 6 people working on them. This game actually, which is called Block Explosion, is going to ship or has shipped or will ship on the Gear VR device coming out soon.
And the things that we learned, from each of these prototypes, we learned something else. So this one, it was like, okay, well, we have explosions, so they need to be like movie explosions, right? You always go into slow motion when that happens, and you're diving away from the car, and it's really dramatic. In this case, it's the same thing, and we played around with turning into slow motion, going into a kind of a slow motion mode at that time, and it was brilliant. Like seeing those cubes fly by you, it felt great. And as you can tell, art is extremely simple, and the mechanic was immediate. The only button you could press fired a cube, it hit something, and explosions started happening. So that was very powerful for this. Kind of an interesting thing that came out of that too. So we were like, okay, well, physics are great, so let's make more physics stuff. And this is one of our craziest designs. We love it still, but it's really weird. So first thing, we're like, okay, so let's throw all these physics fruits at you, right? And it took all this development just to make it stay in the bowl and not dart across the room and go crazy. And then we're like, well, but throwing at the player is more comfortable than the player throwing something away, right? You can perceive it more. It gets better as it gets closer. So we're like, okay, well, what if the tray was your chin? You've got this wok attached to your chin, right? And it brings it into this sweet spot, which is your ability to perceive these objects is so fun when it's right here, and your head is this great, really high-resolution controller, right? Just, we already know how to look around. Like
that's something we didn't expect, really, coming out of this. If you went back and now looked at the 40 or so games that we built over this cycle, is that fully half of them ended up not using the controller at all, which, I mean, we totally didn't expect that. We weren't trying to have that be the case, but that's just naturally what came out of this process.
Right, and it's pretty interesting. Also, the thing that fell out of that is we didn't have to explain the rules to people. As soon as you looked around, you realized, hey, that tray is moving with me. Oh, they're throwing something at me. I better catch it in the only thing I see, which is the tray. So this was a pretty fun game. Here's another thing too. So one of the assumptions we kind of made early on was like, okay, well, so we open the door to all things that are possible, right? Why does it have to be experienced from a human perspective? Why do we have to be, 5 foot something tall and experiencing the world one-to-one? That it seems pretty limiting, right? There's no reason. So we started looking at another additional way. Like IPD, for those of you who haven't messed with it much, is interpupillary distance, right? So essentially the distance between your eyes.
Yeah, in the Oculus SDK, this is a configured value, as I'm sure you guys have seen, that measures the distance, in millimeters between your eyes, and it
wasn't initially exposed.
No, there's actually a line in the Oculus Best Practices SDK that says, "Do not touch this value. Let the user configure it. Do not touch it."
Right.
One of the first things we did is hack the SDK to allow us to scale this value. We just wanted to see what would happen if we messed with it.
And the best way to think about it is like, okay, well, if I'm a giant, that means my head is big and my eyes go really far apart, right? And if I'm a little gnome or something, my eyes go really small together because I'm really tiny. And it gives you this impression of, well, okay, suddenly the world is a model, and suddenly the world is this enormous, like Alice in Wonderland sort of fantasy place. So we said, what is a game that really expresses scale change really well? And we were like, oh, Katamari does this, right? Like you're rolling that ball and suddenly you're rolling up the world, and you're like, how did that happen? How did I get here? So an interesting thing we did about this, or in this prototype, is we subtly scaled it up. So as you play, you start kind of small, and then we're just slowly pulling. And before you know it, You don't even know this is happening. But before you realize it, you're a giant. And you're like, wait, how did I get here?
So the cool thing, too, now is you guys can play with this. After we did this demo, Oculus integrated a new variable in their SDK. This happened a couple of releases ago called camera scale. And I don't think they've talked about it very much, but you can now, at least in Unity, do this officially and change, and it's a linear scale that applies to the camera. It affects the tracking and the positional stuff. It all works correctly, and you can use it to sort of affect the size of the player, basically, dynamically.
Right, and we ended up using a lot of these lessons we learned in Lucky's Tale in the demo that was shown at E3. And you know, when you're doing this, right, like, okay, so I'm throwing out 10 paintballs, right, to keep using that metaphor. So I'm throwing those out. Well, how many of those are just like falling flat or hitting something that's already been hit, you know? There's so many wonderful, glorious failures that come out of that, right? And any of you who develop games, you know that a failure is kind of a setback. You know, you're kind of bummed, but at the same time, it's awesome because you immediately have this tool. You're like, okay, I didn't know anything, and now I know, don't do that, right? I'm immediately sick when I do that, don't do that thing. And so we were really happy with every time we failed because it gave us another tool to kind of pull out, and the next thing that we immediately had to get going on was better for it. And so it's cool because it's like anything that, like I said, anything you write on paper sounds great in VR. I mean, it's limitless just how many things you can write that sound awesome. And there's all these things, they sound like they work. And especially coming from a traditional gaming background, right? You're saying like, oh, I know how to do this, right? I know how to make a platformer or a puzzle game or anything like that. And there's all these things that don't sound, that just surprise you by how they don't work. And so a couple of those are, a good example is like, okay, well, in VR, I want to see this vista, right? I want to like look over and I can see for miles and miles and miles. Well, but in the Rift and actually kind of in the way we're hardwired, seeing beyond a certain point, you start losing your ability to sense a lot of depth.
Yeah, it's actually a hardware thing. I don't know if I think we've talked about this before. Due to the nature of the device itself and the fact that you have a certain limited resolution, convergence causes depth to disappear. Like, in other words, something that's beyond a certain amount of distance in virtual reality, at least in the current hardware, and I think right now in the DK2, I believe it's 50 or 60 feet. Beyond that, you're actually rendering it at the same pixel in both eyes, and depth cues actually go away. You are not receiving any depth cues beyond that distance. The limitation of the hardware, it's resolution dependent, but certainly our experience as well was just subjectively that stuff that was beyond a certain distance from the player just felt like a matte painting. It no longer felt immersive.
It didn't have the impact. You're like, well, I feel like I'm almost playing a regular game here. And like another one would be like, okay, I want to fly, right? And we all want to fly. We'll just do barrel rolls all day. And I mean, for any of you who've played with this, you will immediately make yourself sick, and you'll do all these horrible things. And we did a great demo that completely failed because we just called it our sickness simulator. I mean, it was amazing. It felt like we'd attach this like fully taut bungee cord to you, and then just let go, and you'd just be like jerked in some random direction, and it was glorious and terrible. So I kind of wanted to hand this off to Paul with one of our best failures, so just bask in this. So. I mean, this is, I don't know what it is. It's like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, but this is on the DK1, so we didn't even have positional. Like, you have to just contort. I mean, look how...
It's a great example. This sounds great on paper.
Sounds
we're
good
like,
on paper.
oh, because we're tracking your head, so you're going to dodge punches, and it's going to be amazing, and it was so not amazing.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, clearly, we could have taken this further. I bet there is a boxing game to be made that was awesome, but
sure.
At least in 4 hours, or even in 8 hours, I think we gave this one, we couldn't prove that this was going to work
Turning
very well.
into an elbow macaroni was not acceptable. Like, you can't play a game that way, so we cut it and we set it aside. But I love it still, and I love the pigeon, so that's good.
Yeah. So I want to, I'm going to talk now about how we kind of went from that process, that 6-month process, to what followed, which is the work we've been doing this year on Lucky's Tale. But first, I want to talk about this. Brendan used this, I think it was Brendan, used this phrase this morning, the elephant in the room, to talk about motion sickness. This is, you know, I think for all game developers working on, you know, any new platform, we have a set of things that we choose in ourselves to be our particular holy grails, the things that are most important to us. For us in virtual reality, that has become comfort. That more than anything is defining the things that we choose to do and the things that we choose to avoid. And just by way of context, I'll tell you a little story from me. this was the first real game that I played on the Rift, and probably you guys did too. It was Half-Life 2. Valve put it out for really early on, and after the DK1 came out, and I was so excited about this. Like this was my dream come true, to be able to play this game in a fully immersive way. And I remember, and that night that I played it, the first time I loaded it up, and I'm on the train, and I'm heading into City 17, and I get off the train, and the guy looks like a stormtrooper is there, and he pulls out his baton and he shoves me, and I'm just like, this is the coolest thing, and it was meeting all my expectations. And then I kept playing, and I kept playing, and 10 minutes later, I'm like, I don't think I can do this anymore. and then 10 minutes after that, I was done, and I was sick for the rest of the night. And I know that DK1 had limitations that contributed to this. Obviously, the hardware that had tons of things that we can now do much better with the DK2. But for me, what I realized that night is that a part of the dream that I had been carrying with me for what VR was going to allow me to do once we could finally make games for this technology, I had to let go of. And that was the ability to just be in the Matrix and walk around and do whatever you want fluidly. And I just like, it just clicked for me, like, oh wait, but I'm sitting down, and I can't. The ability to just move fluidly through the environment, as I think Michael Abrash was saying this morning, is like the dream of virtual reality. But the actual reality of it is, it's really hard to do that. And
I mean, imagine a platformer in first person, right? Like that ledge that's so easy to see. Oh, there's a star up there. If you were one-to-one looking, you'd be like, oh, there's something up there. I need to leap 8 times my body height and jump on top of that just to explore it. And the world is huge. Like, you don't get that wonderful kind of enclosed feeling of being in a new world. It's all very kind of distant and hard to perceive.
So for us, this was a turning point in the development of this work that we were doing. Again, it reinforced this idea that we needed to abandon our preconceptions about what it was going to be to make games in virtual reality, but we wanted to do that. That's what eventually led to the creation. This is a screenshot from Lucky's Tale from the demo that was at E3, and the creation of this game. I'll briefly talk about why we chose to create this game. Out of all the prototypes that we had played with, why this one? Why a third-person platformer? This is one of the first, in fact, this is the original prototype for Lucky's Tale that we built. Again, with that same kind of process, this was basically built in 3 or 4 days. And, it was just one of a whiteboard full of ideas that we had that, like I said, literally all over the map. They're from like an aquarium to a music simulator to whatever. One of them was third-person platformer. The moment that we first saw this prototype working, and I remember looking, and I see the little capsule there in front of me, and I'm like, great, it looks like a third person. It's kind of what I would expect. And then I looked up and across, and I saw the whole level stretching out before me. And what I realized in that moment was, this isn't just a neat prototype in this particular case. This is the way this genre has always meant to exist. And I think for you guys who have seen Lucky's Tale, or if you get a chance to, I think there might be a demo in the lounge here. I don't know if we got a chance to set that up. We were trying to. I imagine you'll have the same experience. It's what folks have described to us that have gotten to see this and play it, is I don't want to go back to playing a platformer any other way after I've played it this way. It fundamentally doesn't just kind of make a good VR experience. It makes a better platformer experience.
Right. I mean, what it actually does is it reduces the abstraction. Like, if you think about it, when we play like Banjo-Kazooie or Mario or any of these platformers in 3D, right, we're looking at a 2D screen and trying to estimate our jumps. I was talking to somebody earlier today about just what is true difficulty, right? Like, were those games hard? And how many of those deaths did you get because you actually the jump and where you were in the world was completely misrepresented? I mean, you're like clinging to that drop shadow for your life. And as an anecdote, my wife, she goes through these, she stopped playing games around the 3D, right when 3D became a thing. Because that abstraction of, I need to manage a camera in addition to moving, right? In addition to jumping, that's really hard to do, and not everyone can do that. But this, she put on Lucky's Tale even kind of in an early mode, and immediately it was just like it clicked. There's no more worry about the camera because I use my head, right? And I know how to look around. So that was incredibly impactful for us.
So for us, this thing that we're talking about a lot at this conference, and we've been talking about a lot for VR for a while, is it can do this amazing new thing, which is presence. The thing that we saw, though, with this particular demo was it wasn't just giving us an amazing sense of presence, it was actually enhancing the gameplay. of that genre. That's why we chose to work on it. What I want to do now is kind of, same like what Dan did, I want to talk you through some of the things that we uncovered, some of like kind of where those paintballs landed and the lessons that we kind of learned over the last year as we've been working on this game, some of the crazy things that we've seen try and develop content on the cutting edge of VR. So here's one of them. Dan talked a little bit about this, but what we discovered subjectively working on Lucky's Tale was that when we tried the first thing that kind of sprung to mind with a third-person platformer, and we started our normal game development process of like, great, we're going to need a character, we're going to put him in an environment, we started just falling back on the things that we're used to. So characters a unit and a half high, that's just kind of the normal thing that artists want to do. And so that makes him about 5 feet or 5.5 feet high. The environment is going to be scaled out appropriately, whatever. And we put it on, and it just felt so wrong. The environment, as Dan was saying, it felt huge, super expansive. I couldn't even see the other end of the level. It was miles away. Lucky himself, the character, was feet away from me, kind of like where Dan is, or maybe a little bit further.
I think further, yeah.
Yeah, and then when I went to move the character, I was yanked along behind him because I'm this floating camera at a speed that is kind of his running speed, and it felt pretty much as bad as the Half-Life demo I had played, and so we were super disappointed by this, but we didn't give up, and what instead we started to do was we asked ourselves this question of like, all right. If I think about a game like Mario or Banjo-Kazooie or Sonic or whatever, if you guys think about that, if I asked you, how tall do you think Mario actually is? I doubt many of you would say, well, he's like man height, he's like this high.
He's 6'11", for sure.
6'11", right? And I don't think that's what we're expecting to see, what our perception is of those games, even though really when you're playing it on TV, there's no way to judge distances. But I think a lot of us maybe instinctually feel like he's kind of stuffed animal size, maybe, something like this. So without meaning to, we inadvertently solved some of the issues by going at it that way. We said, all right, fine, let's scale Lucky down, let's scale the whole world down so that he's more like, he's actually about the size of a water bottle right now. And one of the other reasons that we kind of arrived at this was we said, we really want you to feel like you can reach out and touch the character, that you literally he's within arm's reach. And as Dan was saying earlier, we found that stuff that happens in VR at that range of like a foot away from you to, I don't know, right at the outside of where you could reach if you lean forward with your fingertips, that stuff feels the best. I'm sure for you guys who've been developing in VR, you've discovered the same thing. It's why a lot of games that use cockpits now are really good because the stuff is like right here and it's just so satisfying, the sense of depth and just kind of the details you can see.
Like you could reach out and just touch any of those things, manipulate any dial, right?
Turns out that there's science behind this, that we actually have more neurons in our visual cortex devoted to that area from here to about there than we do anywhere else. And that when scientists ask people questions, being able to judge distances, which is kind of the way that they can tell this, your ability to tell something at 20 feet away from you or 25 feet away from you is really difficult, but your ability to judge millimeters of distance here is really good. We think that contributes to that sense of satisfaction that you get when things are in that range. And so what we did in Lucky's Tale, by scaling the character down, is we brought the entire gameplay experience into that arm's reach area. So not just the character is there where you can reach him, but everything he's doing, all the effects, everything that's happening is all happening in this space that kind of feels like it's on a tabletop in front of you. And that was key to making this game work. It also solved a number of other things for us. For instance, I mentioned being yanked behind the character, moving it at a fast speed. If you think about it, if the character is only this big, he goes from running at multiple miles per hour to moving at just a few inches per minute because everything is scaled down. And surprisingly, the perception effect of that is greatly increased comfort because the camera is now sliding along at just like a really slow speed. And actually, for you guys who have seen Crescent Bay prototypes, there's the Epic demo at the end has you kind of sliding forward along this linear trajectory towards this giant robot. The speed at which you're moving in that demo is comfortable, and it's about the same speed as the camera moves in Lucky's Tale. Another thing that we discovered as we've been building this game, and Michael Abrash touched on this earlier today, it's been a big thing for us. the techniques that we've used, art style, in games that we've built before, do not work in VR, at least not in the way we would expect. Textures look like wallpaper. Normal
and they
maps...
can alias. I mean, they can alias
Oh,
and
yeah,
shimmer just all
yep.
day long. It's
yeah,
really distracting.
There's a tons of problems with that. Normal maps don't work the way you'd expect. Bump maps, displacement maps, those things just... What they look like is they look like you're seeing a video game. They look like you're sort of... And what we've found here is that there's... In virtual reality, there's this new uncanny valley. Some of you guys have heard this phrase before. The uncanny valley is this perception thing that happens where if you're trying to look at a human face that's being rendered by a computer, it's really difficult to get it to look good because the closer it gets to looking real, the more awkward and uncomfortable it is because your human perception is trying to say, that is real, but it's not, and that's really making me feel uncomfortable, and I don't like how that looks. What we've discovered is in virtual reality, the uncanny valley encompasses not just your human being's perception of people and faces, it pretty much encompasses everything. Like, even like looking at a tree or a dinosaur or something like that, like you can, the closer you get to trying to make that look realistic, the more your brain rebels against it and says, no, I know that's not realistic, and you're trying to make me think it is, but it's not.
You think it's like a really cool game. You're like, oh, this is really neat, and they can look very impressive, but you're like, oh, this is the best game I've ever seen. And it actually kind of pulls you one step away from, this is the best place I've ever been, right? Or this is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
It does not deliver, or it fights against that sense of presence that we're all striving for. On the other hand, when we've gone with some very different art techniques for how we create the art in Lucky's Tale, we've seen that we can actually create something that does feel satisfying to your brain, does not go into that uncanny valley by kind of sidestepping it. So some of the techniques we've used in the game, we use almost no texture maps. It's very high geometric detail. The scene that I showed you from one of the screenshots of the game is about 2 million polygons. Every nook and cranny and like the little bridges you walk across and the rocks and the flowers is modeled to detail rather than texture detail, and that stuff just looks so much better in VR.
Right, the way the light plays off of it just really reinforces and gives everything a weight. So when you see a crack in the world and it's actually modeled there instead of painted on, you're like, oh, wow, I can really see that the light plays on it just so, and I know, and it feels real.
For you folks that are considering making a third-person game or are excited about that, we have been messing around with the camera for this now for a year, and what we've seen is that there's this direct interplay between the way the camera moves and the way the level is designed. It just kind of makes sense, right? But we've tried a zillion different methods for the sort of motors that drive the camera in third person. We've tried versions that allow the camera to sort of be like a kite behind the player, including rotation as Lucky is moving around. We've tried a lot of different things. What we found, first of all, is that it's extremely finicky, unfortunately, but that everything from the acceleration curves to how quickly like the camera gets moving and how slowly it stops, how far away it is from the character, how high up it is. Every one of these variables contributes to either it feeling great or feeling very not great.
And we spent so much time on this, and when Lucky's Tale first kind of the press got a look at it, and of course the thing you're never supposed to do is like read the comments, right? And people are like, oh, what's so big about that? Just throw a third-person trailing camera on it, done. And we're like, we spent so much time on that. It's not that. You know, you want to type it out, but that's a good idea.
There was a lot of dead ends there and a lot of sort of black holes of development that we ended up kind of finding ourselves in with the camera. What we ended up doing in the case of Lucky's Tale is sort of setting a rule for ourselves in the studio, which is messing with the camera and the motors and the mechanics behind that are sort of the most difficult thing that we can undertake at any given time. And the reason is that the comfort level when you're playtesting and you're developing a game like this is so subjective. So anytime we would make one little tweak to the way the camera moved, we'd have to test it with 100 people to even know whether, because I mean, there's no like little FPS counter that shows, or I should say puke PS counter or whatever, that shows like how sick someone's going to get based on some change. You have no choice but to literally sit people in front of it and say, does that feel good or not? And you're going to get out of 10 people, you're going to get 10 different reactions. So there's not, again, there's not a lot of science to it. It's very subjective. What that meant for us is, all right, we have to back away from like messing with the camera in every level, which was originally our idea. We're like, okay, we're going to have this one boss level where the camera's like below the character's feet, and then we're going to have another one where you're like floating in a balloon above him, and another one where you're right behind him. And we created all these tools for that stuff, and what we found is the moment we put those tools in the hands of the designers and the level creators, every level made you sick, practically, because it was so easy to shoot yourself in the foot. What we ended up doing was swinging to the other end of that spectrum and saying, all right, we're mostly locking our camera down, not because we don't think that we think there's only one way to do it, but just that figuring out the 2 or 3 ways, or however many we end up shipping in Lucky's Tale, how many different camera modes we have, each one of those has to go through a lot of iteration and a lot of play testing. So then we said, well, then how do we solve this problem of how the player navigates the level? And what it ended up doing is pushing all that work onto the level design side. So you can kind of see here, what we ended up doing was the combination of the art style that I talked about, which was this kind of lush, organic world full of tons of geometric detail, we linked that with a fairly linear level design where the character moves from one end to the other. There's not a great sense of exploration of the character. It's not like it's not Mario 64 style where you can run anywhere, because really the moment you start running towards yourself and you have to start having to like dig your chin into your chest to see where the character's going, and you don't really want to have to bend around and look behind you. And so that started to influence the game design, and our levels have become more of this journey that Lucky is taking, where most of the design language in the levels is Lucky goes left to right, front to back, bottom to top, and those things, we've discovered those as we go. We think there's tons more of them, but what we found is that it's much easier to iterate that stuff in level design than it is in the mechanics of the camera.
You ready for turbo mode?
Turbo mode? Yeah, we're out of time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Another thing that we discovered as we've been working on this game, the sensation that you have when you experience a character in VR is beyond any other platform that we've kind of played games in before. So this is actually how the demo begins at E3, and it was so fun for us to watch is that almost 20%, 30% of people that sat down to play the demo, they couldn't help but wave back as if Lucky could see them when they saw that. Yeah. And actually he does some other things which you can see in some of the Crescent Bay prototypes. He follows your head as you look around. If you lean down, it
meets
works
your
with
eyes.
positional tracking. Yeah, he wiggles his nose at you and his ears, and we just saw that we almost can't do enough of that stuff. The connection that you feel to the character is totally unique to VR. And in fact, people play a Mario game and they say, they'll describe it as like, oh, that's me, I'm Mario, I'm going through this level. When people play Lucky's Tale, they never say that, they say we. That's the way they describe the experience. They say, me and Lucky went on this adventure together. And I think that more than anything speaks to what VR can do to this genre. Another thing that we discovered as we were building this game, and this kind of goes to the philosophy of what excites us about being on a new platform, is we really want to try to create something that could only exist in VR, like that you literally could not go and port it back to a console or to a PC. One of the mechanics that we ended up building, and this was based on a prototype, I think it was probably based on the Bloxplosion prototype that we showed you, was a head-controlled thing where Lucky picks up a bomb, and then all you have to do is look at the target, and a little reticle shows up that's kind of attached to your head, and he throws it where you're looking. Almost everyone that experiences the demo, experienced it at E3, described this as probably their favorite moment of the demo. And again, it ties back. People said they felt this sense of cooperation with the character. So now, the work we're doing now on the game to try and deliver it for next year, we're trying to just go overboard with this stuff, because this is the stuff that really feels good and feels unique to VR about Lucky's Tale. Another little thing I just want to mention, you guys have probably seen this. For a long time, and actually leading right up to before we shipped the demo at E3, we had UI in a traditional sense, and it was basically just kind of like what this screenshot shows, like a floating holographic thing that was kind of, if you looked up, you could see how many stars you'd collected and stuff like that. And we just kept getting this feedback that that just doesn't feel good. It feels like something attached to your face, and you're really trying to just be inside this world. So right before we shipped this first demo, we abandoned that entirely, and we said, look, we're just going to turn it off. And then the question immediately came up of well, then how are we going to show how many stars you've collected and this other stuff? And it forced us to have to answer those questions in a new way. And some of the solutions that we came up with I think they actually work pretty good. I think they would work in a traditional game. You can see some of them here. This is some gameplay from kind of not Oculus version, but it works similar to what you see when you're playing in VR. And what you'll notice is that, especially when he runs over some of the stars here, the UI appears in the world, and almost everything in the UI sense works that way. There's nothing on the HUD at all, because that experience here, which looks cool, really is distracting, at least if what you're trying to do is give players a sense of presence.
We skipped to the end, maybe.
Yeah. One last thing that we saw, and I just wanted to talk about, this kind of combines everything. This happened at the last second. It was a kind of a happy accident with Lucky's Tale. We wanted a menu mode for the game, or something that happened before you started playing. And so at the last second, we realized we were running on a really high-end computer with a 7080 GeForce TI, whatever. We said, let's just take the entire level and just put it, like, shrink it down even more and make it this little toy that is about the size of this podium in front of you. And this was the last week leading up to E3. This is probably one of the best parts of the demo. Like, you could literally sit here in just this view and feel like that's a game without even playing the game itself. And I think it just speaks to the power of some of the stuff we were talking about, the scale and the things that you can do with this kind of intricate detail that's all within this sweet spot. So if you guys get a chance to check it out, I recommend just hanging out at the menu screen for 10 minutes because it's pretty cool.
Right. So just to finish it off, like, we really kind of an interesting parallel. Actually, I'll talk over here.
Yeah, sorry.
An interesting parallel about all this stuff is, there's one point where we were just listening to songs on the radio, right, and radio plays on the radio, and you think, oh, that's awesome, that's as good as it gets, and then TV like, the ability to transmit an image happens, and suddenly all the rules are out the door, and you persist with some of the legacy stuff for just a little bit longer, and then you reinvent those rules. Well, we really strongly feel that we're at that moment now, because look at a movie today. Some of those rules were invented in the early 1900s, right at that turn of when this new technology came on the scene, and they haven't changed because they're some of the best ways to communicate these ideas. And we as VR developers, we strongly, strongly feel that we're at that point right now. The rules we discover and the things that we create, those are going to inform VR for decades to come. And it's simply the most exciting reason to be in VR right now. And it's what motivates us on a daily basis. And when we see the things that the community creates, it just thrills us, because for every cool thing that happens, you're suddenly like, oh, there's something else that could be in the lexicon for decades. So anyway, thank you so much for listening, and it's a good talk.